Good morning, everyone. My name is Katie Casey, and I'm a marketing specialist here at ESE Spectrum. And I'm here just to introduce our presenters and our webinar this morning. We'll be talking about what is in my monitoring plan, which we all know is a very important topic. We have with us Susan Kennedy, and we also have Mr. John Konings on the line, and they will be sharing their expert insights on the subject. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please just throw them into that chat box and we will read those off at the end. Take it away, Sue.
Thank you, Katie, very much. I am Susan Kennedy, and I am very excited to be here to discuss our topic today, which is what's in my monitoring plan. Some of my background, I am relatively new to ESE Spectrum, but my previous experience included an investor-owned regulated utility working for power plants, helping with their air compliance, various air compliance, including SIMS, as well as permitting. But today we are going to focus on our monitoring plan. I'd like to start off by expressing what we hope for you all to get out of this webinar. It is scheduled for 1 hour, including questions. We want you to understand what actually is a monitoring plan. Why would we need one? We're also going to discuss the pieces of a monitoring plan, and we're also going to touch on some upcoming changes that we will be seeing next year, hopefully. So with these objectives being expressed, if this is not what you're here for, this is the best time to get your hour back. This isn't what you think you're here to learn, please feel free to drop off, but these are the ones that we're going to focus on. Secondly, I will say that the monitoring plan that we will discuss is quite detailed, and 1 hour we're only going to be able to hit some high-level pieces of it just to give you some exposure to it, whether you've had experience with one before or you're brand new to it. We're going to give you really just a high-level overview of monitoring plans. So I like to start out with, after we talk about objectives of learning, I like to talk about monitoring plans. So what is a monitoring plan? So I like definitions. I like things to be as concise as we can. And in this case, I actually looked up a couple of different definitions, and I've got my source down there below. And these were a couple of things that I found for a monitoring plan. And I like them because they got a lot of really good words. And this is about words right now. For example, a plan that describes some periodic monitoring or compliance or corrective actions, or a detailed approach and methods to be used to collect credible information. And then this last one, detailed, complete, transparent documentation of methodology of a specific installation, including documentation of the data acquisition and data handling activities. Now, each one of these is not a specific definition of the monitoring plan that we will talk about today, but the things that I think any and every monitoring plan has are things like compliance. We see detailed information. We see credible information. I also want to talk about how you're going to do that. What are the methods that you're going to use? And ultimately, you're collecting data, whether it's for air emissions, which is what we talk about today, or really any other type of compliance activity. And for those of you all who have more than one hat than just air emissions, you may have monitoring plans for other types of media, whether that be water, soil remediation. There are some key elements that are similar to all monitoring plans. Once again, compliance, credible information, details about that, the methods that you use, as well as data. And another one that I like, action. What are you going to do? What is this plan describing that you're going to do in order to effectively monitor and potentially report? Although I gave you several definitions, we are not going to talk about other media, and we are specifically going to talk about what we like to call a Part 75 monitoring plan. Part 75 is a term that we like to use. It is specific in the Code of Federal Regulations, and it is specifically continuous emissions monitoring, which is what our company does. We provide services for continuous emissions monitoring systems. So this is a Part 75 monitoring plan. It is related to the acid rain program, and that's under Part 72, just FYI. And that is, a program that has been very effective for many years to help reduce pollution. This plan is a plan that describes the compliance for the acid rain program. It is also a plan that helps to describe compliance for cross-state air pollution rule and mercury air toxic standards. A given facility may be required to report under the acid rain program, and not necessarily the CASPER program, as we like to call it, or the MATS, or maybe all three. But this plan is something that's used for those programs. In addition, the plan is electronic. It is these are data files that are in a specific electronic language that we call XML. They are structured such that the monitoring plan is one of three, as I point out there. The goal of the monitoring plan is to describe how the emissions data is collected and also how it is quality assured. So in that case, we actually have three separate data files associated with the Part 75 monitoring plan, emissions, and quality assurance. In addition, those electronic data files are managed through a system called Emissions Collection and Monitoring Plan System. I like to call it ECMPS. Some people may call it ECAMPS. I've always called it ECMPS. And that is what we're going to actually focus on today in terms of describing the monitoring plan. We're going to focus on ECMPS. So this next slide is a picture of the ECMPS client tool. This is the electronic application, as it were, to create monitoring plans, submit monitoring plans, as well as those other two files, the QA and the emissions files. This is how EPA receives their information for those given programs that I described to you. It is done through what we call a client tool. That client tool is downloaded. We can send you a link from the EPA website. And as long as you have proper access and authority to provide the data, submit the data, you can use this tool. And this is what I today, as I describe the monitoring plan, I'm actually going to give you some screenshots of this client tool as we move forward, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, what you see to the right, you see something called ECMPS 2.0-beta. So that's something I'm not going into great detail today, but we will discuss it. And I'm happy to have John Konings on as well, a senior engineer with us who will discuss the ECMPS 2.0. We'll give just a very brief discussion of it. This is a new system that will be coming next year that we all will need to learn how to use. And but for the sake of this discussion today, the current tool, the one on the left, is the one that we will discuss. So, but before I get into the actual tool and going through pieces of the monitoring plan, I do want to provide some background about the monitoring plan itself and the records. Site specific. Remember in our definitions, we talked about details, we talk about different things. This plan is not something generic that you can run it through the copy machine and just hand it out to any old source. It has to be specific to that source. I mentioned ECMPS. We use that tool to create the monitoring plan, and it also has to be evaluated. And that's a big deal if for those of you that use ECMPS that will be using ECMPS, because these are electronic files. They have to meet certain logic, they have to have certain pieces, and we use the tool itself to make sure they're right. It checks them. Almost every piece of data that's collected for various types of program, it has to be checked somehow. It can be a human checking it. In this case, we do have a very robust tool that checks to make sure those pieces of the plan that we'll discuss later are correct or that they make sense. Some of the records that we will review, these are things that the monitoring plan must include. We got to talk about the reporting programs. I mentioned AST and RAIN. I mentioned MATS, those sort of things. Why are you reporting? Why are you giving us this data? What's this about? It's about those programs. Also, how often should you report? Quarterly, ozone, those sort of things. And we'll go through the actual emission units themselves, what type they are, what sort of fuel, etc. Also about the emission point. You have the unit creating the emissions, then you have where does it come out? I've got some pictures of some stacks there. That's the point at which the emissions are coming, interacting with the environment. Also, the monitoring system itself. How do we monitor it? What sort of things are we analyzing for? What are we using to analyze the emissions and collect the data? And we also like to talk about pollution control devices as well. And another piece will be additional monitoring. Why do we call it supplemental? ECMPS didn't originally report for mercury air toxic standards, but now it does. And that was added, forgive me, this escapes me how many years ago, but it was added as a supplemental piece and will be changing in the future, which we'll touch on a little bit later in the presentation. So a couple of things here to note that I like to think of when I think about a monitoring plan. It is complete. There are different ways within the tool to filter out older information that may not be relevant, but it is there, meaning from the time that you began reporting under this program using the client tool, we can see everything. Information is dated, pieces are linked. So you need to get in your mind in terms of how the plan functions, the logic behind it. We have begin dates and end dates, meaning beginning of a certain program, the end of a certain program. Were you required to be compliant and report under this program and then you weren't? It began a certain date, it ends a different date. Everything can be linked to these begin and end dates. And sometimes when you look at it, it could be a little confusing because it looks like you've got all this information, but then you have to understand that, well, if it ended, it's no longer applicable. So I like to point that out when I'm going through ECMPS to people first. And it's you sort of have to keep pushing that through your brain, I think. It is organized by tabs, similar to other types of programs. OneNote comes to mind when I think about organized in tabs. I also put here that it does have instructions, and this particular, let this underline because there actually is a link here to the reporting instructions that you can find that tell you exactly how monitoring plans, as well as other electronic files, are to be created and organized. Once again, evaluation. You put it together, you change things, you always need to evaluate them, check them for errors. The client tool does that for you, which is pretty cool. Also, the monitoring plan is intended, I talk about complete monitoring history, so it is intended to be reviewed. You don't just create it and walk away. You go through the bits and pieces and review them. Many times, some of those reviews are required annually. Certain pieces need to be looked at annually to make sure that they are correct. But anytime they're changed, you should change them, review them, make sure that the monitoring plan is reflective of your current operation. Okay, So let's chat a little bit about different types of monitoring plans. I like the words that I see here. I can say that when I worked for a utility, I didn't necessarily use these words very much, like full SIMs, Appendix D, Appendix E. I just called them Unit A, Unit 3B. We just knew that Unit A it was an Appendix E, but I didn't necessarily call it that. And once it was determined to be that, we didn't really need to talk about it anymore. But if you do have numerous units, and like our company deal with lots of different types of units and different customers, we tend to lean on these words pretty heavily. For example, something we call full SIMs, and that would be what we would maybe typically see on a coal plant. We would monitor those things that you see there, whether they be SO2 NOx, O2 or CO2, and flow, that is stack flow. We have another protocol that is allowed to be used called Appendix D, quote unquote, and this allows optional SO2 emissions. You're not required to monitor them, but you have a protocol for gas or oil-fired units where you don't have to monitor them directly, but you can calculate them based on your fuel flow. Not volumetric flow like in full SIMs, but actually the flow of your fuel that's coming through the unit. And then the others, Appendix E actually is an optional NOx emissions protocol where you're not monitoring NOx directly, but you have other information that allows you to calculate that. We also have low mass emitters that allow us to use default numbers as well. So the top row there, you sort of see a full SIMs, and we sort of go to less and less and less over the top row. And I mean less, meaning less analyzers or direct measurement, as you move from left to right. In the bottom three, we have just some different things. We have MATS, continuous monitoring, which also includes that SO2 that we talked about, but a MATS affected plant would have perhaps have requirements for particulate monitoring, mercury, HF, or HCl. We also have moisture SIMs, which I haven't dealt with very much myself, and then continuous opacity monitoring systems. You will see that word comms in the rules a lot, but that is for monitoring the opacity coming off a stack. And opacity is a surrogate for particulate, and that is the opaqueness of the emissions coming out of the stack. So we do have those systems as well. I want to touch on how we would typically start creating a monitoring plan. We can use our ECMPS tool, which we will go over here shortly. And like many things, when you're creating something, it's a good idea to start with an outline. I started with an outline on this presentation. And some of those things you want to think out to begin with. Once again, the monitoring plan is very detailed, so it's good to sort of step back and get a big picture. You want to think about your operating, your maintenance practices, your fuel sampling and analysis, if there's periodic emissions testing involved, and how you're going to track your operating conditions and or emissions through your continuous system. There are different ways to comply at a given facility. SIMS is just one. It's a very important one, but you have to have the big picture with respect to how you will comply. And I like to put my plug in there. You can always call us, and we can certainly help you with that as well. So I'm going to start a more detailed discussion of the different pieces of a monitoring plan. I've got a picture there, and throughout the next few slides, I am going to use screenshots of ECMPS. And I do this because that's how I learned. I had someone sit down with me, open up the client tool, and start walking me through ECMPS. So that's what I'm going to do with you guys today. For you all who actually do currently have access to the client tool, I'd encourage you to open it up on a second screen if you have access to a second screen. I've got mine open. It looks sort of like that picture that you see there. So I have mine open that I can refer to if I need to. One thing to mention, we will go through these 13 tabs that you see on the right: methods, components, systems, qualifications, formulas, default, non-flow spans, flow spans, duct WAFs, loads, locations, and unit characteristics for supplemental mats. Although we will go over these, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there's a lot of information in here. We certainly cannot go through every piece in detail in an hour. And I might put you to sleep if we didn't have any interaction, meaning if we were not, it would be if we were in the same room together and I could go through and we could ask questions, interacting, it would be very effective. But I think for a webinar, we're going to keep it at high level. But with that being said, if you do have your own tool, please feel free to follow along and ask questions at the end. So let's jump in. So this, we are starting, I mentioned the 13 tabs. This is a screenshot of a monitoring plan. As mentioned before, the plan itself is site specific. That means how the records are set up is site specific. We'll see a combination of different fuels or pollution control equipment. And there can be constantly changing, actually monitoring strategies that are documented here. We will see things like fuels being burned, pollution controls, once again, pollutants that are being measured, what type of fuel system. We'll also see data would be organized in our emissions files and hourly values. We're not going to get into emissions today, but I just wanted to touch on that because ultimately the monitoring plan is designed to let EPA know how those emissions will be recorded and ultimately submitted, which is sort of the bottom line when it comes to ECMPS. So let's start with the first tab. This tab, which is highlighted, is the methods tab. So some of these, in my humble opinion, some of these words are not necessarily that intuitive when it comes to data collection, but methods is the types of parameters that we see to be measured. In this case, I have a bright red square around CO2, H2O, mercury, heat input. You can see they are all parameter type codes. We're not going to look at every one of them. You're certainly, if you have your own client tool up, you can scroll through those. This is a full SIMS that I mentioned before, so we have numerous parameters that we will be measuring. And if you look below that, as you click on the methods and you highlight one of those parameters, we're just going to start with CO2 and focus on that. You can see that it gives you the information of what parameter is being recorded and how it's being recorded. What is the method? In this case, the CO2 is being recorded down there at the bottom, CEM, Continuous Emissions Monitor. It can be a different type of code. If we look at the top and we go down, we see CO2 highlighted in blue. We see H2O, we see HGRH for mercury, and we see an ST, that's a method code, that's for sorbent trap. So this is where we identify the parameter and we let EPA know what type of method is being used to provide this information. And in this case on CO2, it is being directly measured. There's also a requirement for substitute data. What the heck is that? That is when a system is not available. Could be for just routine maintenance, could be because it broke, different things. There is methods how we are allowed to report data that is not being collected. So in this case, I don't want to go into great detail. This does let EPA know when the monitor's down, how do we substitute data? And there's a standard Part 75, which is a whole nother webinar, but that's just a way to let them know. And then once again, begin date, begin hour. This lets us know when this method was being used for CO2, and it began in 1995 and it has not ended yet. So if it were to end, it would be documented here. The next tab that we'll discuss is called components. We're going to stick with CO2 because I like to stay there. This actually lets you know what type of piece of equipment is being used to measure the CO2. There are things like it's a box in your SimShack. We need to know what type of equipment is being used. We've identified that parameter. We said that it's SIMS. Well, now we need a little bit more information. In this case, we can see that there was a thermo manufacturer, there is a model, and there's also a serial number. And there's some additional details about dilution, out of stack, etc. And if we were to, I have just provided, if we were to click on the next tab there at the bottom, you've got component, then analyzer range. This gives more details about the actual piece of equipment itself, letting you know what the analyzer range settings, and these become very important in terms of what you would expect, how high, how low, depending upon the component, it can impact the types of calibration gases and things like that. So I won't go into the QA that much today, but it is important to know what the range is of your analyzer, of your component in this case. The next tab that we see next to components is actually the system. So this continues to provide additional information about what type of system is being installed at each site. We're going to stick with CO2. You can see now we have a monitoring system ID, and those become important. That ID number is used quite heavily in a DAS configuration. It's also a way to identify more information about how we are monitoring. And you'll see here we have a system code, a designation code, primary. This is the primary system used for CO2 in this case. We could have a secondary, but this lets EPA know what to expect. And once again, we see the begin date and begin hour. We also have a fuel code there. It's actually non-fuel specific. You could have a system that is specific to certain types of fuel. In this case, this is CO2, so it is not specific to a fuel. And if you were to click on the next tab down there at the bottom left, it gives you more information about the actual component itself in the system. This is additional information about the begin date and end, if there is one. So we're going to stick with CO2, and what you see in terms of the component ID, we have a monitoring system comprised of these components. These are the pieces of the system that are involved with CO2. You see a data acquisition system listed as well. So these are different components, and they have different numbers also. So if you can already tell, it starts to get very complicated, which is why we do have, go back to that evaluation step. These things can be hand entered, and they can also be very, you can be prone to typos. So which, as you may not be able to tell, it's very complicated. Want to touch on a little bit about qualification. There are in some cases, a unit may qualify for certain types of designations. This is going back to the low mass emitter unit. It can be this lets EPA know that it has a special qualification. There are other types of qualification. In this case, as an LME, this unit could use different types of data for calculating its emissions, a more simplified system. So this is a way to let people know about that. What you see there is once again a begin date and an end date. If that unit, in this case, lost its LME status, which there is a way that happens annually, then there would be an end date and something else would start. The next tab is formulas. There is a significant amount of information that is collected by the SIM system and reported through ECMPS. And yes, there's formulas as to how these things are calculated. They are listed often in rule. In this case, we're going to stick with CO2. You see there is a formula code there, and once again, a begin date. Down at the bottom, a little bit more information. We do have an ID code for that particular formula. You see it as a CO2 hourly mass rate in tons per hour. F11 is the formula code. You can look that up in rule. You can find it in Appendix F11. That's what that refers to. And it does let you know that that's from a CO2 wet flow. And there is the formula text that you there's a little bit of coded information, like many formulas in there, but that is actually the text that you see. And once again, that begin date and begin hour. If that changes, the record stays there. You don't delete the record. You simply provide an end hour. And if you bump up, you can see some of that in the upper part of our screenshot, where you actually do see some end dates for heat input, HI, and as well as NOx. So, and then I want to touch on defaults. These are records that define things like maximum values, minimum values. They are defaults that are used in calculations. They can include emissions factors, moisture content, maximum potential values. There's John likes to call them a sort of a catch-all record. But there are specific ways to calculate these. They're not sort of pull out of your hat sort of thing, but they are important to the plan. They are important to how data is referred to, how it is calculated. So once again, we're sticking with our CO2, and you'll see that default value is in percentage and 5%. It's also identified as a diluent cap and non-fuel specific and during any hour, and we do consider it a default value from Part 75. Once again, that begin date is listed as well. We're going to jump into some more specifics about the analyzers themselves. And so we are looking at something called non-flow span. So flow, non-flow. So what does non-flow mean? It means that we're not talking about stack flow. We're not talking about the emissions going out, the measurement of the amount of flow of those emissions out of the stack. So these things tend to be pollutant specific, in this case CO2, NOx, SO2. They provide information about the range of the analyzer and then also the span. These are very important. They are required to be reviewed periodically. I have the example again here of CO2. And in this case, it's for CO2, it's considered a high range. Where did you get your span? Well, there was historical data that we used. We have a maximum potential concentration, in this case is 20. So you can see just the different pieces of this particular analyzer. And yes, definitely important to list that. We may have, you see HL, we have high and low. So we may have analyzers with high and low range depending upon the emissions that are coming out of the stack and what we need to do to monitor those. Once again, very important for your overall SIMS in terms of what you would expect for calibration gases and things that you use to QA the system. The next thing is, I said non-flow spans, so let's talk a little bit about flow spans. Yes, these are also one of the pieces of the monitoring plan. Similar in concept to the non-flow spans, except that they are different in terms of what types of unit measurement codes that we may see. Typically things million, in this case I've highlighted million standard cubic feet of gas flow per hour. There can be in different types of measurements. This is stack flow, as I said, million standard cubic feet of stack of flow per hour. But there are other ways to measure that, maybe actual cubic feet. There may be actual feet of stack flow per minute, those sort of things. So this is good information to know so that we are aware of how data is being calculated. And there is, once again, span values that are reported and are adjusted, and this one has been adjusted. In this case, we do see a begin date and an end date. And I'll reiterate, there is an expectation that this information is reviewed annually. And if you do have a contract with us, that's what we provide for you as well. Did want to touch on this one. This is talking, you see the abbreviation RECT, rectangular duct WAFs. What the heck is a WAF? That's a wall effect adjustment factor. I haven't myself personally looked at this in a very long time, but from an engineering perspective, there are things called wall effects that can impact how the flow is determined. And in this case, rectangular duct, and I couldn't find an example of one because they're not used very often. So, but it is, you will see it in your monitoring plan. So I did want to touch on that, but it would be a factor that is calculated by a certain procedure and applied to your stack flow if applicable. So here, I want to talk a little bit about loads. This is pretty straightforward. And so what we're seeing here is how you would define the load of your particular unit. In this case, the units are in megawatts. You see a maximum 450 megawatts. We do define how low the unit may go and how high the unit may go. And then we often have high, mid, low. These are very important to consider. And I see a typo, so I apologize. This is evaluated before a RAT. That's not a RAT, that's a RATA, or a relative accuracy test audit. I'm missing an A on that. But these sort of things are important to evaluate before you perform a RATA, so that you are performing that RATA at the proper operation. And this information is submitted so that EPA knows that you've done it. So definitely important to be aware of what the loads is of your unit, but how it operates. It can go from 30 to 450, but maybe only operates around 150 or 200, depending upon the type of unit. And these sort of things are defined in your monitoring plan. Location attributes. Attributes is kind of a neat word. I like that, but this is what we're talking about, are things that are specific to your actual stack itself, the physical details. We can see here, there's a ground elevation of 415, the stack height's 350. Talking about what is constructed of. This sort of can give you a visual picture of that actual emission stack. You also have other types of things like duct indicators. You also have stack stack height bypass indicators there. Just different types of things that gives you physical information about your stack. And once again, begin date, end date. You'll see that over and over again with defining different pieces. This particular tab has lots of information. This is our unit, the unit itself, the emission unit yourself. We're not talking about the stack anymore. We're talking about the unit. And as I am trying to show here with that lower box, is there's a lot of tabs on that. So this particular unit is defined. It's called G1. It does show when it started to operate. It is an electric utility in this case. It's giving you details about it being a dry bottom wall-fired boiler. And it's currently operating. And if we start tabbing through that, we'll see that we have to define the capacity. And that capacity has been defined, and it wants a begin date and an end date, you'll see. We also have things like unit fuel. In this case, you'll see a C and a PNG, and those are codes for coal and pipeline natural gas. And then we also have unit control. That lets you know what types of controls that are on this unit for the various different types of parameters. And then in this case, this lets us know what programs are under. I talked about that from the beginning. We have a monitoring plan that defines our how we are going to monitor for specific programs. That's why we're here, these programs, whether they be acid rain, and some older programs are listed here, CARE NOx, CARE Ozone, and then you'll see some references to MATS and cross-state programs as well in that list. So moving on to our next and last tab is talking about those units that are MATS affected, mercury air toxic standards affected. And this is another tab that gives some specifics about the methods used due to that. In this case, this particular unit does have quarterly stack testing for particulate matter is what I've highlighted there. That's important to know. That means EPA knows that there's a quarterly test that's going to be done as opposed to a continuous emissions system that could be there to monitor for particulate. And then also you'll see some information about some other parameters, in this case, including hydrogen chloride, and you'll see the QST, which also lets us know that it is also quarterly tested, so not monitored directly by SIMS in this case. Okay, so that's our tabs, and want to emphasize just a few additional things as we start to wrap up. Monitoring plan records are meant to be updated. Everyone, I think sometimes we get caught up with our emissions and our QA. We sometimes forget about the monitoring plan, and that we do need to focus on that periodically to make sure that it reflects existing operation. You got to think about new pollution. We see a lot of changes from coal to natural gas, changes in fuels. We need to know loads information. We need to be aware of span and range, just other types of things to make sure that it is reflecting of existing operation, and also just check it, make sure it's right. And that leads us really to annual review requirements. We are required to take a look at it annually. Sometimes things don't change very much. That's great. You might have a combined cycle that's only runs pipeline natural gas, and that's all it does. But what if your turbine vendor comes in and says, I can increase your loads? Well, then we need to go back and look at the monitoring plan to make sure that our loads are the same, even though they provided some new mechanism to increase loads, those sort of things. So there's a constant need to really take a look at your monitoring plan periodically. I do like to let you know there is additional places to get information, free information. I mentioned to you the reporting instructions from US EPA. There are tutorials on the ECPS support page. And then a lot of times it's not always there, or the tutorials aren't really answering your questions. So there's these great people that you can email, and they will respond back to answer your questions. We do that quite often. Also, I want to mention, we didn't go into the allowance program much, but that is all part of the acid rain, and it is managed through a mechanism called the Clean Air Markets Division. For those of you all who get access to ECMPS, this is where we go. We call it KMD. It's a piece of the overall emissions, and actually is a focus because it is where the allowances, which are part of some of these different programs, are managed. So there is also the Clean Air Markets Division. So before I move on, I'm actually going to ask John Konings to chime in to give us an update. I mentioned that what I'm showing you today is how data is collected and created today. But we do have something that is coming, and that is the ECMPS 2.0 that we are expecting early next year. John, would you like to give a brief update on 2.0 as we see it today?
Sure. Thank you, Susan. Let me explain what we're looking at. We are looking at a screenshot that Susan prepared of the beta test site that is currently available for people to play with, lack of a better expression, and see how the new ECMPS 2.0 tool is laid out. The new tool and the old tool are laid out quite similarly. They look a lot alike, but you can go in there now and you can see how it's organized, and you can look at monitoring plan records for all the units that are participating in the acid rain program. I can tell you that Chris Worley, who is the lead person for the re-engineering process of creating ECMPS 2.0, told me last week that they are working towards releasing all the functionality, or putting in place all the functionality in the new tool, the 2.0 tool, that currently exists in the old tool. Currently today, the beta site only allows you to look at monitoring plan data, but they're working towards the goal of releasing all the functionality for doing all the QA checks, whether that be calibrations, linearities, ratas, fuel flow meter accuracy tests, whatever. They're going to import all that functionality into the new tool starting, they're working towards having this completed next week. At the same time, they will also allow you to begin working with existing emissions data. So for example, they said they would load the emission files from the fourth quarter of 2022 into the beta site. So you can go back and you can use the new tool to evaluate your existing monitoring plan records, and your existing QA, QC records, and even the emission records. And so again, they said they're working towards the goal of having this all become available to everybody next week. And currently, you can look at any unit across the United States, look at its monitoring plan records. But Chris did say by the end of the month and in March that they will lock down what sites you can look at. You will only be able to look at the monitoring data, the QA data, and the emissions data for sites that you have been authorized to look at. So that will be another change. A couple of things I want to mention to you is two things that the EPA has released back in December: updated monitoring plan instructions to help you understand about the JSON file format that's going to be required. The people are going to be required to use starting next January. And so new reporting instructions have become available back in December for both the monitoring plan records, the quality assurance and certification records, and the emission records. Those were released back in January. Now, December, excuse me, they were released in December. I can tell you that I read through all three of them, and there still exists some areas where it's a little confusing of what they're trying to explain or describe. As a matter of fact, EPA has already released an updated version of the reporting instructions for the QA records, in which they clarify, they've caught some other mistakes and they're clarifying them. And so you should be aware that there's a February release for the QA records and then a December release for the monitoring plan and the emission records. I anticipate as we go through the rest of the year and we go through beta testing of the various monitoring plan records we have, your various QA, QC records and the emission records, that people will find other areas that need to be clarified in their reporting instructions. And so I anticipate you're going to see these reporting instructions updated, hopefully not more than once or twice going through 2023. And the last thing I want to leave you with is that next week on Wednesday, March 15th, there is an update that EPA is having to discuss the MATS changes required in the new JSON format, which are required to begin reporting next January of 2024. This seminar will occur on Wednesday, March 15th at 1 Eastern time. And it's again to cover or discuss the MATS changes for 2024. And so if you're not aware of it, you can go to the ECMPS Reengineering worksite and you get that information about that meeting. I encourage you to participate. I encourage you to use the beta test site to practice creating JSON files when the time comes, both in the existing XML file format and in the new JSON file format. Matter of fact, the way I think you could test to see if your JSON files are correctly configured and set up is when you produce a quality assurance record. If you produce it from your DAS in the XML format, run that file through the current ECMPS tool and see what errors you get. Then, for the exact same time period, generate a corresponding JSON file and run that through the ECMPS 2.0 beta site and see what errors you get from that tool. And if everything's set up correctly in your DAS, the two evaluation reports, one from the old ECMPS and one from the new ECMPS, should be identical to each other. And if they're not identical, you may need to go back and work with support groups at ESC Spectrum to correct or update your EDR configuration tool so that both formats are producing the exact same records. So that's probably a little bit more than you anticipated you were going to hear about today. I do want to say that if you have any further questions about ECMPS 2.0, you can certainly ask them now, or I believe Susan has a slide at the end where you list our email addresses. You can always email us and ask any follow-up questions. So with that being said, I'd like to throw it open for questions.
Thank you, John. I'll click through just one last thing. John is open to the 2.0 questions, so maybe while we're finishing up here, if you have any, go ahead and start putting those in the chat. But in conclusion, for the entire presentation, we hope that you understand what a Part 75 monitoring plan is. We hope when you hear those terms that you understand there's a lot of pieces to a continuous emissions monitoring plan. Also understand that we do use ECMPS. I showed you the existing version, the version that we used for many years. John has introduced you to the new upcoming version, more to come on that. But also understand that there's lots of information out there, lots of places to get answers, whether it be EPA or contacting us directly. There is, as John mentioned, myself and John in regulatory reporting, but for those who may or may not know, we do have a team of reporting engineers as well that some of you may work with. They are definitely resources for you also. So I encourage you to reach out to them directly as well. But we are here to answer any questions, providing additional information. So I think we've got 5 minutes left. Katie, I suppose you'll let us know if we have any questions.
Yes, we have one question so far. It says, is there a rule requiring annual review of the monitoring plan?
Yes, to be very short. In
Yes.
Appendix A, I believe of Part 75, it does reference that you should conduct a review of the spans and ranges of your monitoring systems. This review should contain at least 4 QA quarters. Remember, a calendar quarter that has 168 operating hours in it is considered a QA quarter. And I want to stress that if you do this, when you do this review of your spans and ranges and your monitoring plan, even if you make no changes, you should document that you did conduct the review because the regulations requires it. And as you know, through all of Part 75 and other air quality regulations, you're required to document your actions. And so the fact that you did the review also dictates that you document that you conducted that review and what was the outcome of that review. In legal terms, if you conducted the review and did not document it in the eyes of the law, you didn't conduct that review, because part of the review is to document it as well. So yes, you are required to do this typically every 4 QA operating quarters. When I was a customer, and I was a customer of ESC Spectrum for 23 years prior to coming to ESC, I did it every February. I did it after the 4th quarter data was submitted in January, and then I would go back and use that previous calendar year as my 4 QA quarters, and I would stay on top of it that way. So if you don't do it on a routine basis, I would suggest you start performing it on a routine basis. Make up a checklist of things that you need to look at and use that checklist year after year so that you consistently perform your review accurately. I hope this long-winded answered the question.
Yes, thank you.
And I would also add that we have seen documentation of EPA auditing your data and that specifically that piece, and that was actually most recently. So we do know that EPA does randomly audit that requirement as well.
Let's see, a couple more questions came in. Do we have any updates on how the EPA will handle LMEs in the ECMPS 2.0?
Yes, we have learned about 6 weeks ago that Chris Worley, again, the guy at EPA who's heading up the re-engineering effort, said that you should not necessarily rely upon the new ECMPS 2.0 tool to handle the LME functionality that currently exists in the existing tool. I can tell you that because of this, ESC Spectrum is looking at several different options to provide their customers to take over the LME record productions that people previously were doing in ECMPS. For example, one example I was told about is that we would host a website for you, and that you would provide us your background data, and we would run the LME tool to generate the LME files in JSON for you. And that would not require you to get another computer and load software and do all that. That we could remotely host that for you, and once a quarter or once a month, whatever frequency you want, you could generate the LME file and check it yourself. So there are several different ways of addressing the question of LME reporting. You need to contact perhaps our salespeople, that they can explain to you the various options and the pros and cons of each one of them.
Thank you. Let's see, another question here. Will they provide a template for stack testing firms to use for data submission?
The certain types of data that is specified to be included in your EDR files is already specified in the new reporting instructions. Currently, I know personally that I have imported stack testing detailed records into StackVision from a stack testing company who provided it to me in an XML formatted file. That is something we've been doing that here at ESC for at least 15, 20 years. And so I know we know how to do it and import it. We would just probably need to talk to your stack testers and give them not only the XML format, or excuse me, not XML, it's comma separated value format, my mistake. But we need to tell you the order in which those elements need to be provided so they can be imported directly into StackVision and not have to spend hours of doing hand entry for all those stack testing records. So check the emissions reporting instructions, the revised emissions reporting instructions. Check the revised February released QA reporting instructions, and talk to the engineering people here at ESC who can tell you more details about importing those comma separated value files.
Perfect. Are there any more questions? Go ahead and throw them in that chat box. We'll do a last call here as we are running out of time.
This is John. Let me just offer one more thought for everybody. We will probably offer additional seminars like this one going forward as we learn more about the details of ECMPS 2.0 and as we get closer to the deadline. Let me just remind you that starting January of next year, a little bit less than a year away, you will be required to use the new ECMPS 2.0 tool, and I encourage you to practice at the beta site, which you can start. You can already practice importing and exporting monitoring plan records, and by the end of the month, you should be able to begin importing and exporting and evaluating QA records and emission records. So, to me, this is a great time to work out those bugs, make sure you understand how things work. That if you wait until next January to start working on this stuff, there'll be lots of people who will be in the same boat with you, and therefore there won't be difficult to get people to help you because so many people will be looking for help. So I encourage you to be proactive and work on it in 2023.
Fantastic. I believe that is all of our questions.
Well, thank you for joining. Thank you, Katie, for helping organize. And once again, if you do have any question, please feel free to reach out to John, me, or any of the staff at ESC Spectrum. We're here to help you with as much information as we can. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.